Hello. Today we're going to talk about current policy and practice in transition services and essentially covering the last couple of reauthorizations of IDEA and changes that have taken place in transition language. So looking at that legislative end of it, certainly we're not going to get into talking about a lot of the other pieces of legislation that are in your book chapter, and I would expect that you would read those and be able to understand and even pose questions about them perhaps in class. But we are going to focus on IDEA, and we're also going to look at a couple of key models that can be used as constructs for shaping policy, or I'm sorry, practice regarding the implementation of transition programming. So again, looking at legislation through IDEA, but also looking at a couple of the conceptual models that come into play. And here are just our learning objectives that we're going to be covering. First of all, we're going to talk about Kohler's transition education model, and we're going to talk about the career pathways model. The career pathways model is actually following up on what was in the first week's content. We were talking about kids with different pathways to post-school outcomes. And then we're going to talk about IDEA and some of the things that we need to be aware of that happened during the 2004 reauthorization regarding transition services. Let's look first at Kohler's transition education model, and there's actually a link for you to be able to go in and look at that more closely within your week 2 module. But just to give you an overview of all the components that should be part of an effective transition program, and the idea of the program structure, for example, the curriculum and those types of things really are a small part of it. We're also looking at things like family involvement, student-focused planning, student development, interagency collaboration. So again, moving into this way of thinking that transition programming involves more than just planning a student's course schedule, but that really we are looking at ways to maximally involve the student, the family in that planning, whether that be through family training or family involvement or family empowerment or engagement, as is talked about in the module on family involvement. That's upcoming. We want student-focused planning. Again, that this is transition is not a one-size-fits-all type of proposition, that it is to be individually based on specifically what each individual student's post-school vision is and how to best move that student toward that vision. Through the ways that we develop his school program and his IEP goals. Student development refers to that kind of idea of assessment and specialized instruction that we offer. Again, a very individualized type of approach that really brings into play what do students need in terms of life school instruction, what do they need in terms of career and vocational preparation or support services as they move into the community and work settings or even residential settings. And grounding everything within a sound assessment framework, so that we know that as we are moving these students toward their vision, toward their post-school goals, that we are assessing their status relative to those and being able to move systematically through providing the type of instruction that they need based not on our suppositions but on actual assessment data of what this student needs to get from point A to point B, i.e. from K-12 services into post-school successful roles. And then again, we talked a bit about interagency collaboration, just briefly, and moving outside of really this idea of just working with services within the school, but also recognizing that at some point these students may be served by entities outside of our school setting as they move into those adult roles. So building those partnerships and those collaborations with those types of providers while that student is still in school can help provide what we call a seamless system of service delivery. How's that for a sibilant alliterative? to be able to then say, I have done what I can do as an educator. I have established these linkages to be able now to hand off this student to this adult service provider and know that those supports are going to be ongoing. The career pathways model really goes back to what we were talking about in the first module about that there are questions we should ask ourselves about students. Who am I? What are my interests? What are my preferences? What are my skills? What do I possess right now? And what are my visions for where I want to be heading? Do I want to be heading to college? Do I want to be heading to vocational training? Do I want to be heading straight into the workplace? What type of residential type of situation do I have? Will I need a more supervised type of living situation? Will I be living at home? Will I be living with other family members? Will I be trying to move into more independent type of living scenarios? Will I be living with a roommate? Will I be living alone? Will I have the money to be able to support the goals that I want? How will I earn my money so that I can access those particular types of settings that I want to move into? So where am I going? Who am I and where am I going is basically what this is asking. And then how do I engage in a meaningful way? What skills do I need to be able to move into those settings so that I can engage in those settings in a way that's productive and meaningful to me as an individual and makes maximum use of my strengths while successfully addressing my particular needs. So again, keeping in mind that pathways may be different for different individuals and will be different for different individuals, and we need to view this within an individualized mindset. Green proposed that there are four major pathways regarding whether or not you're going to move into community, into work settings, into academic settings, four-year colleges, community settings, vocational training, and also different types um, of restrictiveness in terms of other life roles as well. The IDEA amendment in 2004, the most recent reauthorization that we have working for us, although over 10 years old, is still the piece of legislation that we're working from in terms of special education services. And within that, we need to recognize that there were some significant changes that happened with definition. We talked a bit about that in the first module, and we talked about some of the terminology that's being used in the IDEA definition of transition. And this idea of changing from outcome oriented to results oriented, therefore introducing the idea of having an accountability for us as educators to be able to show that what we are doing is helping our students to move as successfully as possible into their post-school roles. And also this idea that we are working from students' strengths as well as their support needs. So it should be moving us away from a deficit-driven model to an idea that this is someone who has something to contribute to the community, to their family, to the nation at large, and that we need to move forward while recognizing that we need to help these individuals develop skills or accommodate for some of their areas of needs and where they may need supports, that we also recognize that these are individuals with immense potential and immense amount of needs that can help them move to their post-school goals. And we need to move forward with that idea that we're not just fixing, that we are actually engaging not only what we can help provide supports in, but also the strengths that student brings to the table. And again, some of these key changes that happen in IDEA with the new age requirement, transition assessment, types of assessments, and transition services. With the new age requirement, this has really gone back and forth. When transition services was first mandated in 1990, for services, it said that it had to be the IEP once a student turned 16 or 14 when appropriate was in parentheses, and most states just adopted the, rather than try to figure out or 14 when appropriate, which obviously means that we want to start planning earlier for students who have greater support needs. What became kind of the de facto type of or age at which the IEP was introduced was age 16. This was problematic because we had individuals for whom the legal dropout age was, with permission, was age 16. So if we weren't starting transition programming until then we were losing this opportunity with many students to engage in effective transition programming for their post-school life. And for the students that we were lucky enough to have with us for their entire secondary experience, it actually reduced the number of years that we could work with them from, if they graduated at age 18 to only 2 years, if they stay until age 21 to only 5 years, and for those who dropped out at 16, that we had the opportunity to actually plan for their post-school needs for 0 years. So this was not seem to be being the best practice for individuals with disabilities to wait until age 16. So then in 1997 reauthorization, it was lowered to age 14 for certain practices and 16 for others. What that meant is that at age 14, we were to begin looking at, or earlier, this was the latest age, not that it had to wait till age 14, and we certainly encouraged that transition planning start earlier, but at the very latest, that by age 14, students needed to be able to have in place a planning mechanism. That is, that we would begin looking at their post-school goals and their post-school visions, that we start our assessments to be able to determine what skills were still needed to be able to move into those settings, that we were able to provide experiences that might help them identify those post-school goals, that we could engage, for example, in job shadowing to be able to help them make informed decisions, and to be able to then put in place those relationships that we needed to have with those outside providers, those community agency providers, and so that they were in place, because once that student reached age 16, then the plan was to put all that into play, as opposed to the 1990 language, where all of that stuff started at age 16 and ate even more into being able to engage in actual transition programming, because we spent a certain amount of time just getting that set up. So that's what happened in 1997. Then in 2004, we took what many view as a step backward for various reasons, some political, most political, I believe. And what ended up coming out was that the transition planning, we again saw age 16 being set as a bar. But unlike IDEA 1997, where it said that the IEP, when the child turns 16, implying that you didn't have to address it until that student was 16, that now we're saying that has to be the first IEP to be in effect when the child is age 16. So depending on when that IEP is done, that it could be obviously a student who's 15 years old. The message being that if I were to walk into a school on this child's 16th birthday and I pull that IEP, that there should be transition planning already in it. So this was again viewed as a bit of a setback, but interestingly, the great majority of states who were adhering to IDEA, 1997, with the age 14 start of being able to set up this type of assessment and planning and visioning for students and getting resources in place, they saw that as being highly effective, and the majority of states opted to stay with age 14 actually as the age at which to start transition programming. So kind of good news, bad news type of scenario, a little bit of bad news in the mandatory language, a little bit of good news in how states chose to do that. States may always be more restrictive, that is, they can always set the bar higher for themselves. They can just never offer less than what the federal government says. So by engaging at age 14, they've actually set the bar higher, and they're absolutely not in violation of IDEA. Transition assessment is, again, a very vital key to providing transition programming, and the original language regarding transition assessment was very generic. It was, and what states were asked to follow up on is, do we do transition assessment, yes or no? That was not seen as being appropriate, and so one of the things that that IDEA 2004 put into place was the set of SPP indicators, State Performance Plan indicators, and indicators 13 and 14 have to do with transition programming. And within that transition assessment language, through public feedback, went through some changes to indicate that it needed to be age-appropriate type of assessment, and it had to be specific enough so as to be able to identify, again, those strengths, needs, interests, and preferences, and be able to provide information that would very specifically guide us in IEP planning. So now when states are asked to come into compliance through the SPP indicators with IDEA, one of the sets of data that they need to collect is whether or not their levels of transition assessment are indeed specific enough so that they are yielding the types of results that really are needed for effective transition programming. And again, speaking of assessments, that we needed to have assessments not only they're age appropriate, but are specifically related to the domains of post-secondary training, education, employment, and independent living skills. So we need to make sure that all of the domains that we're assessing this student in relationship to, and remember we said that not every student will need the same level of supports in these areas, but we still need to be able to ascertain through assessment as opposed to our best clinical judgment as to whether or not this student needs a particular or instruction in a particular set of skills or experiences in a particular set of skills that will help lead them more satisfactorily toward their post-school vision. And again, transition services needed to be able to assist the child in setting those goals. Course of study became important in IDEA 1997. That was one of the things that was to be under discussion during that age 14 to age 16 phase, where we're actually looking at whether what that student's course of study needs to look like based on his post-school vision. Does that need to be purely academic? Does it need to be a blend of academics and functional skills? Does it need to be almost entirely functional skills? So the idea of course of study decisions became critical because it was actually asking us to consider those pathways, consider where students were heading, and to be able to construct IEP goals and deliver them using curriculum that had content that was best suited to that student's post-school goals. And then, of course, with the age of majority language which went into this was the idea of individuals, once they reach the age of majority, as dictated by that particular state, that they receive all rights and privileges afforded an adult in that state. Meaning entering into their own contracts, developing their own IPs, every right that an adult has, that unless petitioned otherwise by the family to retain total or partial guardianship over those issues, all those rights revert at age of majority to that individual with disabilities. So not only is that a time for informational importance to the families, but also to recognize that this represents a whole new set of skills when one assumes adult responsibilities, and understanding what those responsibilities are and what the consequences are for not carrying them out, but also what the consequences are for others in not adhering to the civil rights of those individuals with disabilities, and those individuals being able to advocate for themselves to be able to access their civil rights, particularly under the Americans with Disabilities Act and or the Rehabilitation Act.